welcome to this U Catholic webinar on the Pope's Apostolic Exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, in conjunction with the Paradisus Day, Danielle Bean, and the Sunrise Morning Show, of which I am host. My name's Anna Mitchell, and I'll be moderating tonight. And I would like to start off with a prayer. This is written by Father John Hardin, and it's called the Crusade for the Family Prayer. And stick with me, it's a little bit lengthy, but I think it's a good prayer to start off with for this discussion tonight. So, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Mary, Mother of God, at your request, Jesus worked his first miracle. He changed water into wine for the wedding guests at Cana in Galilee. Over the centuries, you have not ceased to obtain countless signs and wonders for the poor, exiled children of Eve. We therefore ask you to intercede with your divine Son for the miraculous graces which the modern world so desperately needs, for the conversion and reconversion of whole nations to Jesus Christ and his teaching on marriage and the family, for the heroic preservation among Christians of their faith and the indissolubility of marriage, marital fidelity, and the loving acceptance of children as the bedrock of the Christian family, for the courage of martyrs in all of us followers of Christ, that we may witness to his power to overcome the powers of darkness that are bent on destroying the human family and the moral law. Mary, Mother of the Holy Family and Mother of our families, pray for us. Amen. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Again, that is called the Crusade for the Family Prayer by Father John Hardin, which I just thought was a beautiful way to discuss or to begin this discussion tonight on the Pope's Apostolic Exhortation on love in the family through the lens of Pope Francis. And so I'm very excited about tonight's panel. I'll start off by introducing Danielle Bean. She's the editor of the Catholic Digest. You can find her online at daniellebean.com. She has a podcast called Girlfriends. And probably most importantly to this discussion, she's a wife and mother of 8 children. I'd like to welcome Steve Bowman to the panel. He's with Paradisus Day and the Choice Wine Program. You can find them online at thechoicewine.org. Steve, also a husband and a father of how many, Steve?
2 girls.
2 girls. And then finally, last but not least, you've probably never heard of him, Christopher West. He's the president of the CORE Project and senior lecturer at the Theology of the Body Institute, also a husband and father, correct?
5 children, married for 20 years. God bless my dear wife who puts up with me.
Well, welcome to you all. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm looking forward to talking to you about this apostolic exhortation. Just a couple of notes to begin with for our participants who are listening in. Welcome to you all, and thank you for being here. Really excited to have you along as well. We have a question box. You'll notice there's a little dashboard on your screen where you can you see a whole bunch of different little lines, I guess you could say, and there's one that says questions. If you have a question tonight, type that in. I'll be monitoring it throughout the evening, and I can't guarantee that we're going to get to all of the questions tonight because there were almost 1,000 people that signed up for this webinar. So if you all have a question, we're just not going to get to it. I apologize, but I will try to get to as many as we can when we get toward the end of our discussions. And I also want to just note right off the bat, because there has been a lot of chatter about this apostolic exhortation, and one thing in particular. So if you were joining this webinar tonight looking for a debate over the infamous Chapter 8, and whether or not divorced and remarried Catholics should be admitted to Holy Communion, and whether or not the Holy Father believes they should, this is not the webinar for you. That's not what we're looking to do tonight. We're not looking to debate about church teaching over that particular issue. Now, Chapter 8 is probably going to come up in our discussions, but I just want you to know right off the bat that we are not going to be debating that tonight, because there are a lot of other things of interest to families in this document that these panelists are really excited and itching to discuss. Am I right?
Absolutely.
You got it.
Okay. Okay, good. Well, I'm going to start off with just a very simple question for each of you, and that is basically what stood out to you in this document, so that we can kind of lay the framework for the discussion and see where each of you wants to go with this. So, ladies first, Danielle, could you just what are a couple of things that stood out to you in Amoris Laetitia?
Well, for me personally, what I especially appreciated was Pope Francis's emphasis on the idea that imperfect love, which is what we all experience inside of our human relationships, is still love. And that we work with what we've got inside of our families and inside of our relationships. So that, those of us who are living out family lives, we know all too well those imperfections of day to day living, those ways we fall short, the ways we disappoint one another, the ways our loved ones disappoint us. And we can get stuck there. And I love that the Holy Father reminds us that we're called to something greater. And the fact that we fall short of that something greater, maybe more often than not, maybe 9 times out of 10, is not an excuse. It's not a get out of your marriage free card. It's, you got to put in the work and you got to put in the time. And I love that he reminds us that married love is sacrificial and that family life is sacrificial. I think that that's a countercultural message today, because the message that the culture tells us about marriage is completely foreign to the one that the church teaches, which is, that you go into marriage for what you can get out of it for you. To your spouse is there to make you happy. You need to find someone who's going to fill your needs. And yet what the church teaches us is that married love is about self-giving. It's about sacrificial self-giving. And so we need to hear that countercultural message. We need our Holy Father to remind us of that, because so many of us are living out day to day in those imperfect trenches. And I think it's easy to get disillusioned. It's easy to feel despair when you see some of the lofty and very beautiful and very true teachings of the church, and yet see your own marriage, see your own relationships, your own parenting fall short of that. And so for the Pope to remind us that imperfect love is still love, and that we're still called to something greater, even when we are weak, even when we are failing, I think is such an important message today. And I was so heartened to read those words.
Absolutely. All right, Steve, we'll go to you next. What stood out to you?
First of all, I thought the entire document was an incredibly beautiful document, and if we don't get hung up in Chapter 8, incredibly beautiful document. And 2 things probably stuck out to me more than anything else. One was from Pope Francis's own image himself, that the shepherd needs to smell like the sheep. And it was obvious to me when I read this document, this was a pastor who had spent a lot of time with the sheep. That if you talk about nailing marriage and family life, both the challenges we have in it and the beauty that's there, I was like, this is a man who's not writing a theological treatise. This is a man who has spent time with the sheep. And I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunity to talk about that more later, but I think he's just, first of all, an incredibly warm man who is speaking from the perspective of, I have spent time with you, I've walked with you, now let's walk together. That was one thing that struck me. The other thing is a vision that actually soars when it looks at marriage. Although he understands all the imperfections, all the challenges, by the same token, there is that challenge of the vision that soars, so much so that by the time we get to the end of the document, he's talking about how marriage can lead us to the heights of mystical experience. So, here's a pope that on the one hand smells like the sheep, and on the other hand is already having a vision of heaven, and this document challenges us to make that entire journey. I think that's incredible.
Yeah. All right, Christopher, what do you think?
Well, Steve, I'm just going to build right on what you said. I couldn't agree more with both what Danielle said and Steve of what this document did for me. I remember I was on an airplane pulling into the terminal at the Dallas airport when I read that section that Steve just referenced. I'm going to read it. It's section 316. He says, Christian spirituality becomes incarnate in the communion of the family. Hence, those who have deep spiritual aspirations should not feel that being married and raising a family detracts from their growth in the life of the Spirit, but rather they should see it as a path which the Lord is using to lead them, as Steve mentioned, to the heights of mystical union. I gasped and groaned in the airplane as we were pulling into the terminal in the Dallas airport, and people looked around at me. It's like, oh, sorry, I'm just reading Pope Francis. It was such an affirmation to me of what I have been struggling to teach people, good people in the pews. I've been traveling the nation and the world for 20 years trying to share this vision that marriage really and truly can lead us to the heights of mystical union with the Lord. And you get a lot of blank stares. We have this idea that mystical union is just for people with the stigmata or, Teresa of Avila and her bodily levitations. The Catechism speaks of that as the extraordinary signs of the mystic life. And very few of us are ever going to experience that. But the Catechism also speaks of this call to the ordinary mystical life. And Pope Francis in this document, just as Steve said, he's showing, and just as Danielle said, it's in our imperfections. It's not despite them. But that's where we encounter the Lord, in our daily struggles, in the daily reality of married life. As so many saints have said, we find God in the ordinary things of life. I think it was Teresa of Avila who said, we find God in the pots and pans. And we can certainly apply that to married life. We find God in the changing of the diapers. We find God in the ordinary realities of married life. And if we follow the Lord there, it can and does lead us to the heights of mystical union.
Well, going off of that point, Christopher, I thought we would talk a little bit about, church teaching on family life. And that's what you devote your whole life to, is talking about how marriage reflects the life of the Trinity. Can you tell us? Can you hear me?
And I'm so sorry, there is a glitch in some of what I'm hearing. I gather, you want me to reflect on how family life reveals the image of the Trinity? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. I had to read your lips, though, to get that, because I didn't hear it.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, Pope Francis affirms this beautifully. No fewer than 10 references in the document to how the family becomes an image of the Trinity. But he's also very careful here. He says, this does not make God sexual. This does not pull down God to our level, but rather, in the life-giving communion of man and woman, we catch a glimmer, we catch an image of the inner life of God. This is an astounding proclamation. And it's really the fruit of 2,000 years of Christian reflection. We have been given a dramatic development of teaching in John Paul II's Theology of the Body, when John Paul II says that we image God not only as individuals, we image God also in the call to that marital communion, what he calls the communion of persons that we find in the male-female relationship. And even more so, what we're discovering is that call to communion, to image the Trinity, it is inscribed by God right in our bodies. Our bodies are not only biological, our bodies are theological. They reveal the call to holy communion. A man's body does not make sense by itself. A woman's body does not make sense by itself. But seen in light of each other, unless we're blind, we discover the unmistakable design of the Creator, that we are called to a life-giving communion. This is John Paul II's teaching, and Pope Francis is beautifully reaffirming it and even taking us to the next level in his document, The Joy of Love.
Well, okay. Danielle, I want to go to you next. So every family faces its own challenges. Every family is going to be different. But what do you think about the Pope's call to love, no matter what the challenge is?
Yeah, that's a high call, right? I think that every one of us kind of shakes a little bit when we hear that, no matter what the challenge is, because we all know in all too gross detail our own personal challenges inside of our personal relationships. So when you hear the Pope saying that call to love despite those challenges, it really is a greater calling, a higher calling. And I love what Christopher was sharing about John Paul II's writings, because it is such a beautiful teaching that is so beautifully reaffirmed by Pope Francis here in this document, that idea that inside of our human relationships, we have that privilege, a beautiful privilege of reflecting that, being an image of that communion and relationship that takes place in the Trinity. That we learn that we're all built for that communion with our Creator, and yet we experience it in smaller ways here on earth inside of our human relationships. And when you think about that, it's a tremendous responsibility, but it's also a tremendous privilege to participate in that kind of communion, to be that communion inside of your marriage as male and female, and then when your marriage is fruitful, to that bond with your children, to represent that bond, be their teacher in that human relationship that we're all built for, which is meant to reflect the relationship that we're meant to have with God. And I just find that that's so beautifully reiterated by Pope Francis in that God is calling all of us to relationship. God speaks to all of us in language of relationship because he knows he built us for that. He knows that that's what we respond to, what we're made for. And so many of us are searching for it. And, our culture gets marriage wrong. It gets the family wrong. It sends out confusing messages about these things. But Pope Francis is so clear about the unchanging teachings of the church with regard to marriage and family in a way that's very affirming. And when people listen to it and hear it, they can experience it inside of their own lives, inside of their own marriages in a beautiful way.
Yeah. Actually, that leads me to a question for Danielle, because Danielle, you were on the Sunrise Morning Show earlier this week, and we were talking about softening your heart in marriage, and we discussed a little bit Alice von Hildebrand's book, By Love Refined, Letters to a Young Bride, and we were talking about the Tabor vision of your spouse. Can you talk a little bit about that in light of what Steve was just saying?
Sure, I was thinking the same thing when he was speaking. Alice von Hildebrand in her book Letters to a Young Bride it so beautifully describes this idea of Tabor vision that we're meant to have of our spouse. And means by that it's a reference to the Transfiguration, where Christ was revealed to the people that he was with, living with, and traveling with day in and day out here on earth, who didn't see him for who he truly was until that moment when he was revealed in all of his glory to them. And they could see him in all of his glory and were astonished and in awe. We are meant to have that kind of vision of our spouse, because if we could see our spouse made in the image of God as God means for them to be, that we would have that same awe. We would see that same glory, that same call to greatness. And so we're meant to be reminding ourselves of that inside of marriage. And what Alice von Hildebrand says so beautifully is that true love is not blind. True love truly sees. It truly sees the other for who they're meant to be, for who God is calling them to be. And that's such a beautiful thought, that we're meant to keep that Tabor vision, or whatever you want to call it. You want to call it what God made your spouse to be, the person that God is calling them to be, which is great, which every one of us is called to greatness, called to holiness, called to be a saint. That we're meant to see our spouse for that person. We are the ones who are meant to have those eyes for our spouse and be that person, that relationship in their life that calls them to that higher place, that calls them to that greatness, that even though we know their flaws in greater detail than anyone else, we need to know their greatness and their potential for greatness, their call to holiness in greater detail than anybody else on earth.
Christopher, why is marriage indissoluble?
Well, if we recognize what marriage is meant to do, which is sacramentally reveal and in the sacrament efficaciously communicate the love of Christ in the church. That means really and truly effectively communicate the love of Christ in the church. Well, then it has to be forever, because marriage is a participation in divine love. When Jesus talks about committing adultery if you divorce your wife and marry another, what he's saying is not so much divorce is wrong, but divorce is impossible. If one is truly married, that means it's a valid sacramental marriage. Divorce is not just wrong, it's impossible. What God has joined, nothing can break. Why is that? Precisely because of the sacramentality of marriage. It is a true, effective participation in the mystery of divine love, and God's love is forever. Jesus says, I will never leave you, I will never forsake you. And in the document where Pope Francis is talking about the indissolubility of marriage, he beautifully and pastorally demonstrates that this teaching of the church on the indissolubility of marriage is not imposed by the church from without, but it wells up from within. It's a demand of the human heart, and it corresponds to the way we're made. Just turn on the radio, and you will hear love song after love song talking about this forever love, right? Keeping you forever and for always. It's one of a billion songs I could sing about a love that lasts forever. I'm an 80s guy, so you got to remember the old Journey song. I'm forever yours faithfully. I often joke, what if that song went like this? For 2 weeks I'm yours, then I'll leave. It ruins the song, right? Because the song is a beautiful song because it corresponds to the true longings of the heart. We're made for a love that lasts forever. And the reason we're made for a love that lasts forever is because we're made in the image and likeness of God. And He Himself is a love that lasts forever. That's why marriage is indissoluble, because it's a real participation in the love of God.
Well, you bring up music of the culture, and I know that your buddy Bill Donahue does this a lot with Twisted Mystics. There are a lot of songs today, though, Christopher, that, and this leads me into what I want to discuss now about obstacles that we see from the culture to the ideal of family life. There are a lot of songs out there now that are about hooking up, that are about one-night stands, that are just, I mean, if you listen to the words of the song, I can't turn on popular radio when my toddler is in the car because I don't want her hearing that kind of stuff. I mean, that's got to be one of the obstacles that the culture throws at us in family life, don't you think?
Without a doubt. And here we have to recognize that the devil does not have his own clay. This is a bedrock principle of Catholic theology. And what does that mean? Or what do I mean when I say the devil does not have his own clay? All he can do is take God's clay, and God looked at everything He made and said, "Behold, it is very good." All he can do is take God's clay and twist it up, distort it. Even the most distorted hookup song on the radio, it is not evil in itself. In other words, there's something good in there that got twisted up, right? Christ comes into the world to redeem the body, to redeem human love, to redeem human sexuality. That does not happen by taking the messed up thing and throwing it out the window. It happens by entering into the tragedy of the distortion and untwisting what got twisted up. The first miracle is at a wedding. Why? Because Christ came to redeem marriage. Why? Because this is what suffered such a fatal blow with original sin, the fundamental human relationship. Why is the enemy in our day after marriage in such an intent way? Well, it's precisely because marriage is a great mystery that reveals Christ's love for the church. He's after the icon of marriage, because if he can twist and distort this icon, if he can twist and distort sexuality, for example, it will no longer point us to Christ and the church. It will point us in a very different direction. The gift of redemption, the gift of salvation, is the redirection of our desires, our passions, our yearnings for the infinite toward the infinite. And Pope Francis is so clear on this. If I might just reference one passage. This is section 145 of the document. He says, "My being attracted to someone is not automatically good. If my attraction to that person makes me try to dominate him or her, then my feeling only serves my selfishness. To believe that we are good simply because we feel good is a tremendous illusion," he says. And yet, then he says in 148, "A person can certainly channel his passions in a beautiful and healthy way, increasingly pointing them towards altruism and integrated self-fulfillment that can only enrich interpersonal relationships in the heart of the family." So, 2 points here. We've got twisted up by sin. We're all that twisted up clay. But the good news is Christ can come in there if we welcome him there, and we can be untwisted. We can learn really and truly what it means to love.
Yeah.
And by the way, that means even a twisted up pop song on the radio can be untwisted. And we have to learn to teach our children how to do that. Yes, sometimes we have to turn the radio off, but other times we have to enter in and say, "Hey kids, let's rediscover the good in this song that got all twisted up."
Yeah, and I want to go back to that point. I know this is something that stood out for you, Danielle, when you were talking about when he was quoting Pope Francis talking about to believe that we are good simply because we feel good. That triggered in me a thought that I know you shared with me about the fact that love is more than a feeling. And that really comes out in this document too.
Absolutely. And I think that's such an important point to make because it parallels very much what Christopher was just saying about our culture twisting it, getting it wrong. And that some of those pop songs, yeah, it is about love as a feeling, what's in it for me, using other people, those kinds of things. But there is that truth there. And the reason why we're attracted to these kinds of feelings, we're attracted to that idea of love, however poorly it might be expressed in whatever pop song. It's a universal attraction that we have to this, and that's because of a universal truth and a universal good that we're called for and that we're made for. And so it is important to have those conversations with our kids. And I find, especially now as a mom of teens, that I'm talking with their friends who have from all kinds of backgrounds, and we've got all kinds of conversations happening around here. But what I find is so helpful is that the everlasting truth that's taught in our church is such a beautiful resource and tool for us. Not saying, here's what the church says and just hitting the kids over the head with it, but just helping them to discover, you know what? Let's look at what you're made for, what your longings of your heart are, what that means about what you're made for, and what makes you feel fulfilled, what makes you feel empty, what kind of ways can you find meaning inside of your human relationships, and what does that tell you? And we start there, from where they are, from the things they're experiencing in their very real lives, in their very broken lives, with very broken relationships as examples for them all around. And yet we can from there have a great conversation that can very incrementally lead them toward those universal teachings of the church, because guess what? It's the same thing. It's the same truth. The truth that's built into our bodies, the truth that's built into our natural law, that is what we're made for, that every human being experiences. I always tell, my kids and their friends, I'm like, everybody's Catholic. They just don't know it yet. Because the fact is, they realize and they accept those truths when they experience them, and you can help them to discover them. And once they get there, then you can go back and say, oh, hey, what did the church say about that? Oh, it actually matches up with what we just discovered about your personal experience and the kinds of things you experience and feel every day, even inside of our brokenness and weakness.
Steve, I want to go to you now and go back to the point about obstacles found within our culture to the ideal of family life. Now, I know your whole life right now is devoted to helping people achieve a super abundant marriage. I love that word, super abundant, that you use. But before we get to the point where you can start working toward a super abundant marriage, what kind of obstacles have you seen couples have to overcome in order to get to that point?
And first of all, I'd like to go back to the Pope's exhortation here to look at that. And his whole chapter 2, he deals with what he sees are obstacles. And what I'd love to say is I think that if you look at a couple of different points, to me, that draws an entire line of his whole thought process, and also making everybody, or not everybody, a whole lot of people in the West uncomfortable with the Pope. And I think he absolutely nails it on the head. And the three words that stick out to me here that also find their way into the document on the environment and lots of other teachings are an individualistic mindset, as a consumerist mindset, as a disposable society. And in this document, he comes right back to this. And he says, you know what? This individual mindset is striking at the heart of families. And it sure is, and when you go back to the Garden of Eden, Genesis chapter 2, God grieves for man to be alone. Isolation in God's mind is not what he intended for us. It's communion, and after the fall, the first thing we have is, once more, isolation. So this concept about just me is all part of the very fallen world, and this it's all about me is definitely striking at the heart of, no, it's about we, not me. And so this whole individualism, and then that leads easily to a consumerist mentality. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to buy things and all these things that fulfill me. And I'm going to do all these various things. And so I'm going to get the greatest home, the greatest vacation, the greatest car, or whatever it may be. And then it leads to a disposable mentality of, oops, I'm tired of this car. Or I'm tired of this television or whatever it may be. And you dispose of it. And he took that exact line of reasoning and placed it right in the middle of our relationships. And he said, this is what's going on in the home today. Is we have a bunch of people who are struggling with this whole mindset. And so all the other things are symptoms of a very internal mindset that says, it's about me and everything I can consume, and whatever doesn't fit with that, I dispose. And when we do that to people in whatever fashion, it doesn't matter the fashion, that's the objectification of another person. That this other person is now an object for me to get whatever fulfillment I want in whatever way. And when that person doesn't provide that, I dispose of that person. And so, independent of the symptoms that we see of all the other small things, I think he nailed it when it came to what's at the very root. And now that gets to be uncomfortable for a lot of people, because in the West, in the United States, individualism is a pretty big deal, right? We don't want anybody telling us what to do. And we all like the fact that we get lots of things. We have a culture that provides lots of things. And so he's saying, you know what? Maybe that whole mindset is actually striking at the heart of family. I think that's the starting point. Then there's lots of things we can talk about that he identifies many of them in the document as far as symptoms of that, but the real key is right there.
Well, Christopher, I want to throw that to you then. You can see this line of thought through the popes, the last three popes that we have had. John Paul II talked about a culture of death all the time. Pope Benedict XVI referred to it a little differently. He called it the dictatorship of relativism. And Pope Francis constantly uses the term the throwaway culture. How has that affected the family?
First, I just want to say, Steve, that was a great synthesis of Pope Francis's thought. Thank you for that. It actually, as you were saying it crystallized for me some of Pope Francis's teaching. Even if you were on the most secular television show, the most secular talk show, as soon as you start talking about, do you want to be loved or do you want to be used? And if you can get into the real desires of the human heart, I don't care who you're talking to, we don't desire to be used as a thing. We don't desire to be treated as an object. And this whole idea of the throwaway culture, any human being who is alive and in touch with his heart is going to recognize that as soon as you apply that throwaway culture to a human being, it is a terrible threat. What is the phenomenon in our culture today? It's nothing new, of course, but you have these men in their 60s who've been married for 30 plus years, who are divorcing their wives to go marry a 25-year-old hottie. I put that in quotes. What is going on there? Such a love has never reached what John Paul II called the unrepeatability of the person. A person is unrepeatable. Characteristics of a person are repeatable. What do we mean? Red hair, eye color, certain personality traits, body types. These things are repeatable. And if love only reaches repeatable characteristics of a person, well, where is your love going to turn when the characteristics you fell in love with in your spouse have now faded? Your love, quote, I'm putting that in quotes, your love is going to turn to someone who has those characteristics in a more heightened way. This is why love is never on a firm foundation when it only stops at repeatable characteristics of a person. And you know what's scary? We see this even in certain Catholic circles, certain online dating sites, Catholic dating sites even can fall into this, where you go onto the site and you describe the kind of person you want to marry, but a lot of these descriptions just stop at the repeatable characteristics of a person. So you come up with your list, you come up with your shopping list, and if you're only stopping there, guess what? You're going to find 100 people who have those characteristics. Who are you going to marry? Love must mature, John Paul II says, from the repeatable characteristics of a person. Attraction to those repeatable characteristics can be what he calls the raw material of love. but we often mistake the raw material for the finished form. We have to mature in our love from repeatable characteristics to the unrepeatable mystery of the person. There is no other Wendy West in the world. And if my love reaches the level of Wendy West in her unrepeatable mystery, then that relationship is on a solid foundation. And even if I find red hair very attractive, my wife is a brunette, by the way, if I'm out to dinner and a waitress shows up with red hair, but my wife knows she's loved in her unrepeatable mystery, she's not going to feel threatened. She's not going to feel like, oh, Christopher's love is now going to go to the waitress, because she knows my love is for her. But if my love is still in that repeatable characteristic stage, okay, now Wendy's getting older and she's no longer as attractive as the waitress is. Where's my love going to go? Our relationship is threatened. The very foundation of human permanence and the permanency of love is threatened. So that's the throwaway culture in a nutshell. It is love that has not reached its finished form. We've stopped at very surfacey attractions, and we have failed to enter the mystery of the unrepeatability of the person.
Well, how do you get to that point where you go beyond the repeatable love as opposed to the, getting to the unrepeatable?
We have to allow love to take us on a journey. And that's very scary and very threatening. And I'm not speaking from theory here, I'm speaking from experience. I often tell the story in my lectures, so this is nothing new, but I've been married 20 years. Right about the 10-year mark of our marriage, I was offered a very lucrative book deal by the biggest publisher in the world to write a book for husbands called Loving Her Rightly. I came home from this New York business trip where the publisher wined and dined me, and I was all excited to tell Wendy about it. And you should have seen the look on her face when I told her the title of the book. Get this, honey, this big New York publisher wants me to write a book for husbands called Loving Her Rightly. The look on her face was like, you are in no place to be writing such a book. And she said it plainly. She said, Christopher, you and I need to talk. And it's going to be long and it's going to be painful. But let me tell you right now, you're in no place to be writing this book. So maybe for the first time in 10 years of married life, I actually had the grace to listen to my wife. And I did not pursue that book deal. Instead, I let my wife tell me what it was like to be married for 10 years to the theology of the body guy. And she was right. It was long and it was painful. I was wearing so many masks. I was the teacher of this theology, so I thought I had to have my act together. And what that did was create this incredible pressure to be perfect, and I just hid behind my masks. I wasn't looking at my brokenness. I wasn't on the journey of really addressing the weeds that were among the wheat in my life. We're all wheat and weeds, and we all have to have people who love us enough to point out our weeds. And my wife had it up to here when I was offered that book deal, and she compassionately and mercifully, I don't want to give wives out there any license to go beat their husbands over the head, but compassionately and mercifully, she started unfolding for me where I was wearing these masks, and I wasn't looking at the real journey of maturing in our love, and that's a scary thing, but it's absolutely necessary.
Danielle, I was wondering, could you jump on that from a female perspective, from a wife and mother's perspective, how you go about calling a spouse out if they are struggling, but also recognizing that you are someone that struggles as well?
Yeah, well, I'm not perfect at it, but we get better at it every day. Being married 22 years. And, one thing that I was thinking when Christopher was speaking about that beautiful idea of that loving the unrepeatable person, the unrepeatable aspects of who that person is that is a very important point to make about the difference between, just loving an idea or the physical aspects of somebody versus truly loving them for who they are, for the person that God made them. And yet we shouldn't get caught up on the idea that we have to have achieved some kind of perfect love before we can get married. Or, I was thinking along the lines of, yes, when Dan and I met in high school, freshman biology class, there was this instant connection between the two of us that was totally inappropriate for the age that we were at. And yet, we dated a little in high school, broke up, big, messy, whatever. But then we were on fire to get married straight out of college and just have a bunch of babies. That was our big plan. Like, we just want to get married and have a bunch of babies. There was not a ton of thought about, what kind of love do we have, and that kind of deep reflection. But I think nature, and when I say that, I mean God, speaks to us inside of those kinds of feelings and inclinations as well. Not that we should follow our passions without giving thought or rationality to the things we do, but the fact that we were both just so connected with one another, so on fire with the idea of, I just love you so much, I just want to get married to you and be with you forever and have a bunch of babies. Like, that's a good thing inside of us. That's a good drive inside of the human being. And having that inside of our young relationship as a married couple was very helpful, but then it was also very hurtful when we fall short of that ideal and where we were struggling and kind of, in those times when we did need to call each other out. And, I think people, you can't always choose at what age you get married, but there is a trend in our society now where people are getting married later and later because of these outside things, because of, wanting to be in a good place financially, wanting, complete your education, or, having a college fund for your child before you even get married. And, there's an excessive level of planning, in my opinion, in a lot of times. I know sometimes you can't control when you meet the right person, but I always encourage young couples that drive that you have, if you're both in a good place spiritually, and your relationship isn't based on a sinful kind of attraction or living out of that attraction, then it's a good thing. It's a good thing to follow that drive. And what I find that young couples do, and I certainly experienced this inside of my own young marriage, is you grow up together. You learn these hard lessons together. And that's a beautiful thing to do. It's a painful thing to do. When Christopher's describing that conversation with his wife, I've been on both sides of that inside of my own marriage dozens of times. And, there is always a place for that. And there's nobody on earth who is in a better position to do that than your spouse, to call you to that higher place, because they know you and they love you despite the knowing. And so they love you enough to call you to be your better self and let you know when you're falling short in some way. And 1,000 times I've needed that check from Dan in my life, and he's needed it from me. And we aren't always gracious about the way we give it. It's important to remember that you do need to be gracious about how you give it, because that affects how it's received. But that's the sort of thing that having those kinds of communication, those kinds of conversations, we get better at it the more we do it. And sometimes I just want to I want to strangle myself sometimes, because I'm like, why is it taking me so long to learn this lesson? Like, why did I do that again? That thing again that I know does this and spirals downward in this precise way. And yet incrementally, we are getting better. I think we're still growing up together. We're still growing up inside of our relationship. And that's a beautiful privilege to be able to do that with another person.
Steve, speaking of growing up, one of the things that I know Pope Francis talks about a lot in his document, Amoris Laetitia, is the importance of better marriage preparation. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. And by the way, I think all the bishops, even when they were at the meetings over in Rome, one thing that everybody focused on was the need for the church to do not only better marriage prep, but continuing catechesis and this whole idea of accompaniment. And so it's a big thing now that it's not just a drop-off that, okay, congratulations, you're married. And I think part of the whole Pope's vision within this is looking at the starting point where we're encountering people today. And so the perfect example is we have crossed a threshold on a couple of major statistics in our culture that tonight, for the first time in our culture's history, less than half of children will go to bed in a home that has their natural mother and father. Which means the majority of our culture does not know what you and I just define as this is a normal family. Well, throughout history, at least when we're talking about Christian history, we've assumed that, kids learn about family in family. So where do these kids learn all this stuff? Well, they grow up with mom and dad, and they kind of see that mom and dad have some difficulties. They work it all out. They make sacrifices for each other. And therefore, we've had this kind of bedrock that kids just learn all this, so then we tell them the other basic stuff, and then they can be family. Today, the majority of the children in this country never learn that. And they don't have the opportunity to learn that. And so I think that becomes the foundation for saying we need to encounter people. One of the beautiful images about the Pope is encountering people where they are. And, he uses the Samaritan woman at the well, and he even uses that in that difficult chapter 8, where his whole vision of what we need to do is we need to encounter the culture like Christ encountered the Samaritan woman at the well. Here's a woman who's very broken, and she's broken precisely because of her family. She's had 5 husbands, and the man you're living with now is not your husband. And this woman is in isolation. She comes to the well at noon when everybody else isn't going to be there. They all come first thing in the morning. She comes when nobody's going to be there because they're probably talking about her when they come early in the morning. And so here's a woman who's in isolation precisely over a bad family situation. Christ doesn't tell her, you got to get this sorted out, young lady. Instead, he encounters her right there. He helps her discover the desires of her heart. And then from there, he leads her, and then he turns her into the evangelist. At the end of the day, the town is converted because of her testimony. That's the whole image the Pope has for us here. And he's asking us in the church and everybody who works to do this, when you go out and you encounter those millennials, don't go out there with your moral book saying this is exactly what happens and doesn't. Instead, go out there and encounter them with the desires of the heart. That this is the desire of the heart, there's a path for that. And that's even when we talk about our 7 steps to a superabundant marriage. It's like, there's a path to have true joy. And it's not rocket science and it's not hidden. It's just that most people haven't had a chance to discover it. But there's a path, not just to avoid divorce, but, we talk about these 7 steps. 4 out of 5 couples that live them are very happy, the highest possible category of happiness. So marriage can lead to incredible happiness, and that's the normal desire of the heart. We should not encounter people with the assumption that they know it. We need to encounter them with the assumption that they're broken, encounter them in the brokenness, and then help lead them from there.
Well, I know you want people to obviously take part in your program, but can you give us a little bit of a taste of what those steps are?
We go through, and they all tie back to the Holy Family at Nazareth, first of all. And I won't go through all the Jewish theology that you got to go through to get there. But the reality is that because it's all part of this mystical heights that the Pope says you can reach in the home. And just ask yourself this question. Where was the greatest mystical union ever attained on this earth? In the home of Nazareth. It wasn't in the temple in Jerusalem. It was in the home of Nazareth. That's the starting point for understanding the dignity of the home. Well, and then within that context, we go through and we say 7 steps to superabundant marriage. We go through and say if you honor your wedding vows, you use money for other people, you give God some of your time, those 3 things reduce the divorce rate to essentially 0. Then when you set your mind on the things above, find God in yourself, find God in other people, and then practice superabundant mercy, those things give you that foretaste of heaven, which 4 out of 5 couples are very happy, 1 out of 5 are happy, 0% doing that are unhappily married and still married. So there's a pathway to fulfill the desires of the heart, and it's there, and it's all within the church. And it's if we just open up the riches that we have to people, the natural desire is for it. We just need to open the riches.
But Danielle, those steps, those take work.
Yeah, welcome to marriage and family life, Anna. It's work. And, I found myself so disillusioned when I first had my first child, my daughter. I called it my mother. And after, a couple of weeks of being a parent and said, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me how awful this is? How terrible and challenging this is? And I always go back and I smile when I remember it now because I've been through much more than that at this point and survived and thrived despite it. But at the same time, that feeling is real. It is the worst challenge I've ever faced. How can I possibly do it? And so we need to recognize that, especially with young couples today, how very challenging it is early on. Those of us who've been married, 10, 20, 30 years, you get to a certain place where you are comfortable in that relationship, and there are things you begin to take almost for granted, not in a bad way, but just that we worked that out already. We've got that part figured out. But you can forget what that struggle is like early on. It's very challenging. It is very hard. And, that's why it's important to talk about married life as a vocation. That idea of vocation is lost in today's culture. The idea that every one of us is built for making a gift of ourselves. self-giving love in relationship to another. And yet inside of our marriages, if we take what the culture tells us, we're looking to fill our own needs. We're looking for someone who's going to meet all of my needs and make me happy. When what we need to be looking for, and the church reminds us, is somebody to whom we're going to give the gift of ourselves, pouring out of ourselves. And that is a painful thing to do. It's a beautiful thing to do. It's richly rewarding to do it. And yet it's a very challenging thing to do. And if you're not properly prepared for that, if you don't know that that's what's going on, I was raised in a beautifully Catholic family with all this notion of vocation and everything else. I still wanted to make that phone call to my mom and say, what the heck, Mom, this stinks, And so if it's that challenging, we need to remember that, especially as we're looking to support young marriages, especially as we're looking to support young families, how deeply challenging it is and how tempting it is to throw it all away, because that's what the culture is telling every one of them. Every outside source of information is telling them, it's hard, they're not meeting your needs anymore, they're not making you happy, this situation isn't making you happy, throw it away, move on, find somebody who's going to make you happy, move on to the next step. And there's nothing more destructive to ourselves and to our souls than doing that. And ultimately, ironically, to our own happiness, our own fulfillment, our own sense of satisfaction inside of our relationships.
Well, Christopher, when we talk about our path to heaven, our paths to heaven, obviously there are two primary, your vocation is your primary path to heaven. And so in family life, it's through your spouse that is your path to heaven. And do you think that that's something that's lost on a lot of people, that we forget that Will, my husband, is the one who's supposed to be getting me to heaven. I'm the one that's supposed to be getting him to heaven. And that's going to take sacrifice, just like Christ sacrificed his life on the cross.
Pope Francis quotes in a document from John Paul II, who said, spouses are the continual reminder to the church, and we could expound from that to the world, of what Christ did on the cross. Whoa. That means if you're really living married life as it's meant to be, a sacrament of Christ's love for the church, there are times where you're going to feel that crown of thorns pressing in. You're going to feel those nails going through the hands. You're going to feel that sword going into the side. I like to say, drawing on from the point that you made about preparing for heaven, that marriage in this life is really marriage preparation for the marriage of the Lamb. The Bible begins with the marriage of man and woman, but it ends with the marriage of Christ and the church. And Jesus says there's no marriage in the resurrection. When Christ returns and the whole reality of the universe is consummated in Christ, men and women will no longer be given in marriage. Why? Because the very purpose of marriage, the union of man and woman here on planet Earth, is to point us to the marriage of eternity, to lead us there, to get us there. And there's no longer a need for a sign or a sacrament to point you to heaven when you're in heaven. What we're really made for is the infinite union of Christ's marriage with the church. Pope Francis brings this up on several occasions in the document. I'm going to quote here from section 320. He says that spouses must stop expecting that from that person they're married to, something which is proper to the love of God alone. This demands an interior divestment or detachment. The space which each of the spouses makes exclusively for their personal relationship with God not only helps heal the hurts of life in common in marriage, but also enables the spouses to find in the love of God the deepest source of meaning in their own lives. This is so important. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that it's the source of every disillusionment in married life. When you go into marriage expecting another human being to do what only God can do. And the only thing that thing which only God can do is fill that yearning for infinite love. The best my wife can be, the best our relationship can be, is a little glimmer, a sacramental taste of that eternal reality. If I turn to Wendy, expecting her to do something for me that only God can do, I will put a burden on her that no human being can bear. And I know that's the source of disillusionment in my own marriage. I had all this theology in my head when I got married. but I was still bent towards my wife in a way when we got married, and she was still bent towards me. And it took us years of fighting it out, wrestling it out, learning how to love one another in a deeper way, and learning how to straighten up and take our yearning for the infinite to the infinite to free us from that pressure of demanding from the other that you be something only God can be. It's a long journey.
Yeah, and Steve, when talking about, each of our, we've been talking about how there are obstacles that are coming up against every family individually. How would you encourage a couple, in the midst of any obstacle that they might be facing, how to best go at them and try to achieve this soaring height, this ideal of marriage?
Sure. And if I could, before I specifically answer that, one thing that, and obviously everything we're all saying is true about the challenges of marriage, and we all face that. I'd like to also just recognize how many times I've had people walk up to me and say, thank you for recognizing the joy that marriage brings.
Yeah.
That, you know what, sometimes we have a tendency to so overemphasize the struggle and the sacrifice and all those and they're all real. But we don't sometimes, and especially to a culture that's very wounded and they're wondering about why to get married. One of the best things I can say, the reason I get married is because what I do is I struggle every day at work and I come home to find joy. It's not that I go to work to find myself and find fulfillment. I do, in my case, of course, I feel called by God to do what I do, so I'm grateful and I do that with joy. But you know what? I come home and it's with Shelley and Anne-Marie and Mary Rose. That's where I find my true joy, getting to hang out with the kids and have fun and getting to do things with Shelley. And the first expression of joy in all of Scripture was when man meets his mate. And before that, he's in paradise. And he's got everything he wants in paradise, but there was no joy until there was communion. And so even though all these things that we say in the fallen world, there's not going to be the joy without sacrifice, and there's no roses without thorns, and all of those things are true, nonetheless, sometimes I think we have to help people understand, there's an illusion that money's going to bring you joy or your career is going to bring you joy. What's going to bring you joy is finding someone that you can share your life with, and even if you have to grow, and as you grow, there's some real bumps and bruises that happen when you grow, that's the best joy that you can ever have in your life. The first thing I'd like to do is just affirm, and I think the Pope wants us to do that, affirm the joy that we find in this journey, even when it's a road that's got plenty of bumps along the way.
Can I share a quote, Steve, from Francis that just reaffirms everything you're saying? I think it might help the listeners. He said, this is section 130. He says, after suffering and struggling together, spouses are able to experience that it was worth it because they achieved some good, they learned something as a couple, or came to appreciate what they have. Few human joys are as deep and thrilling as those experienced by two people who love one another and have achieved something as the result of a great shared effort. So there it is. There's the fruit of embracing the sacrifice. It leads to joy, and Steve is absolutely right to underscore that.
So to answer your question just very quickly, is the number one remedy that I give to everybody is the Eucharist. John Paul in Familiaris Consortio said that our marriages are not only born at the Eucharist, they're continually sustained by the Eucharist. And the beautiful thing about the Eucharist is you learn that with every crucifixion, there's a resurrection. And that's true in our marital lives as well. No matter what difficulty I have, I know where I can find a resurrection. There's all sorts of practical things, but the number one practical thing is to bind your marriages strongly to the Eucharist.
To add to that, I was listening to Father John Riccardo recently, and he was giving a talk on marriage and advice for how couples can grow stronger together. And Steve, I'm hoping you can talk to this point as well, because it's about going to the sacraments together. And he said in particular going to confession together, not in the sense that you both walk into the confessional at the same time. Obviously, that's not what we're looking at. But he said to go to confession as much as possible as a couple because pretty much almost everything you're going to be confessing is going to be related to that spouse, which I thought was funny. And then he said, but what that does is show your spouse that you recognize that you are a weak vessel and that you want to be cleansed of that, and you want to make amends, and that you want to get better.
Absolutely. And I would say confession as well as the Eucharist. And one of the things that the Pope highlights in his document, again, as far as the struggles that we face, is just the fast pace of the life we live. And you constantly see people making the choice that, okay, honey, you go to Mass now with these kids or by yourself. I'll go do this. And we don't even do the sacraments together. And what we all have to understand is efficiency strikes at the heart of love. Love is not efficient, or better, love has an efficiency of its own. And sometimes I have to choose to be inefficient to put a primacy on love, which would include going with my spouse to the sacraments, be that Eucharist or be that confession.